Episode 17 of Apothecary Diaries starts with Jinshi essentially wanting to dress up as a commoner and go into the city. Now, this isn't really a rare occurrence in history actually. The life of most of the noblemen and the emperor was pretty much a full-time job. There wasn't an idea of holiday in the past, therefore people usually just work non-stop. Some of the most diligent emperors usually only get 2 holidays a year, their birthday and New Year. Other time it's just work. So inadvertently, some of them will just try to live a decadent lifestyle, but usually that was a sign of a bad emperor. But even for the good ones, sometimes they needed like a vacation. So what happens is that in the past, they used to just dress up as commoners and go into the town. Usually not to the countryside. Chinese cities historically were all walled, and for Imperial city, you have an inner wall separating the Imperial palace and everywhere else, but there was also an outer wall. So what was considered the city would essentially be inside the outer wall, but outside the inner wall. Emperors might dress up as commoners and just go about in the city, but they usually wouldn't go anywhere else, to the countryside, for example. In a lot of cases, noblemen might do the same thing, mainly to avoid attention, because as a nobleman, you were expected to behave a certain way, to basically have a certain degree of pageantry and even entourage. And dressing up as a commoner and pretending to be someone else basically allowed you to ditch all of those. As they were dressing up Jinshi, we got pretty much a confirmation that he practiced with his sword regularly. No pun intended, actual sword, as we mentioned a few episodes back. Now we see the callus down his hand, showing that he's actually a hard worker. Those kind of callus only arise when you practice a lot. If you just pick up a sword and just play around with it a little bit, that wouldn't happen. Those calloused hands come from years of dedication. Once again, something a mere eunuch wouldn't be required to or find necessary to have. Now when they actually go into the city, of which I assume will be the market street, which in reality they would have been actually quite close to where the Imperial Palace is. Based on the layout of historic Beijing and even modern Beijing, most of the market streets and where most of things are happen on the south part of the city. You have the Imperial Palace in the center, and whichever part that's south of it would have been the more busy market district. Now, dignitaries and usually more well-off residents, they would have lived north of the Imperial Palace. When we have a look at the layout of the actual market street, you can see signs on the walls. Some of them will read sweet, which the Chinese were able to produce malt sugar for quite a long time. Therefore, things such as sweets, which were difficult to obtain otherwise, would have been much easier for the Chinese historically, due to the fact that the availability of malt, which is derived from wheat, would have been much easier to obtain compared to, say, sugarcane and cane sugar, or even honey. So you had this sweet shop, but the most abundant shops along Market Street would have been for more or less cooked snack. Things like what we mentioned in the first episode as well, skewers. And we do see a skewer stand where they are cooking skewers, a very traditional setup with a rectangular shaped stovetop. Usually these things would have been filled with charcoal, and skewers, which are essentially meat on stick, will be put on top of it parallel to each other and then rotated as it cooks. Although, if you notice in detail, what they mentioned in this specific episode is that they got chicken skewer rather than lamb skewer for this stand. Now, there is a reason behind this, in that after all, once again, this is still a Japanese show by a Japanese author, and based on taste, preference, and even availability of food source, lamb skewer generally weren't really commonly eaten in Japan. Unless if you go to, say, like a Chinese restaurant in Japan. Japanese traditionally had skewers, but they're usually chicken, And that's what I found in Japan. They don't eat a lot of mutton, so basically lamb or goat meat. And when I asked around, there wasn't any specific limitations or any specific reason behind it. It just never was a thing. They never thought about eating lamb or goat meat in Japan. Now, most Japanese, when they tried lamb skewer, they actually quite enjoyed it. It's just that probably with the author's background being Japanese, that wouldn't have come across them. When they think about skewer, usually chicken will come up in their mind. Whereas in reality, the tradition of eating skewer meat in China dates back to Eastern Han Dynasty, so more than 1,000 years. But throughout that period, most of the record and archaeological find showed that the preferred meat for essentially skewering and barbecuing would have been goat meat rather than chicken. Because generally, chicken was raised more for their eggs, and egg-laying chicken over time, the meat will be quite tough. It wasn't to say that there wouldn't be chicken skewers, it's just that by comparison, chicken would have been, as mentioned in the show by Mao Mao, used for soup and stewed together with things like radish. Now they've gotten that part right, mainly because Japanese do stew chicken with radish as well. But in terms of source of meat for usage on skewers, generally speaking, any Chinese will prefer lamb skewer over chicken, unless if they're allergic to lamb or there is specific reasons why they don't eat lamb. Some people don't like the taste of, say, goat meat or lamb. They think it's too gamey, but overall, that would have been the more popular one and more readily available one out there. Now, in case if you're wondering, in imperial palaces, you wouldn't have these kind of what's essentially street food. Interestingly enough, if you go by a case-by-case scenario, imperial palace servants back in ancient China might not have been eating well compared to the outside. The kind of variety they had in the imperial palace was essentially based on rank. High-ranking concubines and emperors will enjoy much better food than everyone else, and sometimes if the servants were lucky enough, they get to enjoy what's essentially the leftover from emperors. Because generally speaking, emperors do have a lot of food available on their plate. They usually, even for the most insatiable like gluton, they didn't eat all of them. If they did, every one single emperor would have died of a heart attack by age 20. So what happened was most of these food, if they found it to be tasty enough, they would have been given to someone else as a reward, essentially. So some of the luckier servants will get these leftovers from the emperors. But other than that, general set meals in the imperial palace weren't really fancy by any standard. They would have been essentially a work meal. Whereas if you were living outside the imperial palace, then you might be able to go to some good restaurants. Now the key difference was that although imperial palace might not have the tastiest food, overall, at least they would have had food. So by comparison, even at the most difficult part of years, if the majority part of capital area was experiencing famine, at least the imperial palace would be well fed enough. So in terms of actual stability, that part of the imperial palace will win out. But if you were looking for anything specific, say if you want to enjoy the occasional street food or snack, the imperial palace food, generally speaking, though on average quite nutritious, they wouldn't be as tasty. Now, other than that, we are shown with the scene of Jinshi's servant, Shilian, actually going over what's Jinshi's toys growing up. And any Asian would find this very familiar because these things are essentially what traditional toys would have looked like for kids growing up in China. Now, nowadays, they get their Ultraman figure and they get their toy gun or a Super Soaker and so on. But back then, these would have been what they played with. The most easy to tell one is probably a ball. It's actually a handball, usually with a bouncy center, made sometimes with animal bladder, and then you have twines wrapped around it. So it's actually quite bouncy. Not as bouncy as air-filled balls nowadays, but nonetheless, it has some bounce to it, so you can just dribble the ball. And other than the ball, the most obvious one would have been the kite. Quite typical Chinese kite style, usually depicting a swallow with a split tail and generally this star-shaped construction. we have some figurines of soldiers, which figurines would have been played by both boys and girls. It wasn't really like a doll or specifically a girl thing. You have what's the modern equivalent of Army Men or like G.I. Joe. Back then, it would have been made of clay or wood, but high-end ones generally would have been either clay or porcelain. There's also that toy that you kick, made of feather, and what Australian's holding in her hand is a tiger plushie. That is very traditional. Like, I even had one when I grew up, but I don't know, throughout moving to Canada, when we were young, I probably lost it somewhere and wasn't able to find it anywhere. But that was a very traditional toy, which is like a tiger plushie. It works as a plushie, and tiger was seen as a form of divine animal. Essentially, it's also used to ward off evil spirits. And lastly, what she's holding in her hand is actually a drum. Now, this doesn't look in particularly like it, but usually these kind of drums will have 2 strings and 2 hammers attached to it, and it would have been covered on both sides. So kids will just turn this around rapidly and the hammers will strike both ends and making drum sounds. You can't really tell from this, but that's essentially what it is. And we see Jinshi's what's essentially Secret Service bodyguard actually following them around. Interestingly enough, whatever he's doing is actually the right way of eating skewers. Mao Mao and Jinshi both got one skewer, which they are big ones. If you have an opportunity to go to China, there are big skewers, but most of the time the skewers are not that big. You don't just eat one. The general rule of thumb is that you eat a whole handful, like what this guy is doing. Obviously, since they are continuing with the trend, they are going to show the wedding symbol once again. Like, I don't know what's gotten into them. This is actually not the only show I've seen this. When it comes to Japanese animating stuff remotely related to China, some of the things they've gotten quite right, like the style of lanterns and everything. But they, for whatever reason, like to put the wedding symbol everywhere. Like this flyer in the middle of a quite busy street. People obviously weren't getting married in this. Like, unless if they're trying to show people getting married constantly, which I'm pretty sure they're not. They just like using this symbol without actually knowing or caring too much about the cultural meaning behind it. It's like you throwing a wedding bouquet wherever you feel like it on a scene. So to a Chinese person, this is somewhat bothersome, especially when you have everything else that looks accurate enough and then you have this. Now the last bit is that interesting conversation between Mao Mao and Jinshi about her adopted dad and how he's trained and how he's related probably to the Rear Palace and the internal affairs in the Rear Palace. For the last 500 years, China was in more of an isolationist situation. But it wasn't always the case like this. China's geographically pretty isolated throughout history, surrounded by deserts and high mountain ranges, and seas that are generally quite hard to navigate. Compared to, say, the Mediterranean, it's much more difficult. But nonetheless, throughout history, although being geographically isolated, Chinese did have contact with outside world, and essentially being on the far eastern side of the Eurasian continent. Almost everybody to the Chinese would have been a Westerner. So this part about Mao Mao mentioning her dad actually studying Western medication, it just means that he studied foreign medication. In terms of him actually going abroad to study, there was one quite famous expedition in the 1400s by, interestingly enough, a eunuch who essentially went around down south into South China Sea, all the way around into India and probably Horn of Africa. And the guy's name was Zheng He, and yeah, he was a eunuch, but he went on huge voyages and these very large fleet of gigantic ships known as treasure ships. If you're interested, you can look more into it. But essentially what happened was that he went on these expeditions bringing exotic items back. But because they were only exotic items, they weren't anything in necessity that the Chinese needed. After a few expeditions, there were a lot of pushbacks. Generally because these kind of expeditions were costing more money than they're bringing back, and they were seen as something unnecessary. So after him, both Chinese mentality and policy turned very strongly isolationist. There weren't any voyages after that, so from that point onward, the Chinese essentially missed what's known as Age of Discovery. Although, even though they missed the Age of Discovery, it wasn't like they didn't have contact with the Western world by any stance, because in the 1600s, Macau was established. At that point, Macau wasn't really a colony or anything. It was more just Portuguese actually asking a place to moor their own ships, so they have a place to actually trade. And Ming China at that time really didn't think too hard about this. They weren't thinking we're giving away land or anything. They just thought we need a place to basically put these people, and they just put them in Macau. Because of the existence of Macau in the 1600s, the Chinese weren't completely cut off from ideas or contact with the West. So this whole bit about Mao Mao's dad studying Western medication, although rare, that wouldn't have been unheard of.